Number 58 on AFI's list of 100 Years, 100 Movies is 1925's The Gold Rush from the legendary Charlie Chaplin. This movie follows Chaplin, as the Tramp, seeking his fortune during the gold rush in Alaska. This movie is an excellent showcase of Chaplin's wacky vaudevillian style, where he mixes comedy expertly with real human emotions. The Tramp makes his way into the snowy wilderness of the Yukon Territory in or near present-day Alaska. This perpetual underdog is hoping to strike it rich. He's then caught in a brutal snowstorm, and he seeks shelter in the only possible place, a remote cabin. This cabin is already occupied by a man known as Black Larson, played by Tom Murray. Larson is a wanted man who's wary of anyone finding him in such a desolate place. The uneasy pairing is joined by a third in Big Jim McKay, played by Mark Swain.
Keep that in there.
McKay is his prospector who is actually lucky enough to strike gold, but he's unable to get it out because of the storm. He puts a sign up at his claim before seeking shelter in the very same cabin. The three have no trust for each other, but are stuck for a while. The trio becomes a duo as Black Larson ventures back out into the wilderness during the storm. I think he's looking for food. Inside the cabin, audiences get a scene that became a classic comedy staple. To fend off starvation, the Tramp boils his shoe and shares it with McKay. There's some nice comedic additions to the scene, like the Tramp making sure that the plate that he's putting the boiled shoe on is clean. He gives the sole, which is all covered in huge staples, to McKay and keeps the leather upper part for himself. McKay, the physically bigger and more intimidating man, swaps their plates. I came across a couple sites debunking the rumor that the scene had the Tramp boiling his hat to eat it, and I'm not sure how this would have got thrown so far from what actually happened in the movie. The Tramp's hat is an iconic part of his look, but the scene wasn't that at all. Black Larson has his own story for a bit. He runs into some lawmen and evades capture. Fleeing them, he ends up having a turn of good luck. He runs into McKay's gold claim. Inside the cabin, the Tramp and McKay are still starving. The shoe apparently didn't hold them over. Younger viewers, and I'm using that term with some serious relativity, as this movie turns 100 years old this year, will recognize this next bit from countless Looney Tune cartoons. McKay keeps hallucinating that the Tramp is a giant chicken and is determined to eat him. These kinds of scenes, the more physically active ones, are classic Chaplin, as he is a master of physical comedy and finding new ways to heighten the already ridiculous scenes. When the storm subsides, the Tramp and McKay go their separate ways. The Tramp, still starving, makes his way into a gold rush town. He visits a local saloon and ends up falling for a young woman named Georgia, played by Georgia Hale. Georgia is popular in town and clearly from a social rung a few steps above the Tramp's own. For a while, she doesn't notice the strange little man, but ends up using him to make a point to another pushy potential suitor. Understandably, not feeling too welcome in town, the Tramp takes back to the wild again. He comes across another modest cabin. This one is in far better shape than the first, and he lays on this helpless victim act very strongly. He pretends he's practically frozen stiff and on the edge of starvation. The kind man who owns the cabin, Hank, played by Henry Bergman, takes him in. There's some more classic comedy bits as Hank is trying to nurse the Tramp back to health, and the Tramp lets his act slip a little bit to add sugar to his coffee and eat the kind man's meal, basically turning him into a waiter. Kind-hearted Hank has the Tramp watch over his cabin and take care of his mule, while Hank and his partner go prospecting for their own gold. Fed and warm, the Tramp's luck continues to go in his favor as Georgia and her friends come across the cabin. He's thrilled to play host. When Georgia discovers the Tramp has a torn picture of her that he found in the saloon under his pillow, she isn't creeped out, but actually finds it charming. He sets a New Year's Eve dinner with her and her friends. The Tramp puts a lot of effort into the dinner party, but he is forever the underdog and gets stood up completely. It wasn't malicious, the socialite just forgot, which in some ways is a whole lot worse. If she intended to not show up, at least she was thinking of the guy. McKay and Larson end up running into each other again, and the movie takes a turn I absolutely did not see coming. McKay finds Larson mining McKay's own gold claim. He's understandably angry. Larson smacks him in the head with a shovel so hard it causes a concussion. Larson flees, but fate intervenes and he dies in some karmic justice of an avalanche. Such a light-hearted movie that saw a man picturing another as a giant chicken just 20 minutes before had a pretty real death. The Tramp meets back up with McKay, who is in a state of confusion because of his blow to the head. That same hit made him forget where his gold claim is, but he does remember that it's near the cabin they took refuge in from the storm. He offers the tramp half of the profits in exchange for helping him relocate the cabin and extracting the gold. The tramp agrees, as he should. That's a pretty sweet deal. But he makes sure that they have plenty of food this time. The dangers of the Alaskan wilderness aren't over yet, and another classic comedy bit that has been replicated countless times since debuting here occurs. The teetering cabin scene has that same cabin from the beginning on the edge of a cliff, going back and forth over land or falling into its destruction and the death of the tramp and McKay. Not only is this scene a great time for some more physical comedy, but it's fairly suspenseful for a comedy movie where you know that the lead has no chance of dying. It's also an accomplishment for visual effects in the time it was shot in. In the end, don't come at me about spoilers, this movie is a century old. The tramp and McKay are on a ship heading back to civilization. The tramp is now rich and meets up with Georgia again. She now sees him as an equal, and the movie ends with them in a warm embrace. What would have really sold the movie for me at this point is the tramp rejecting her for only liking him now that he has money, and finding a much hotter girl aboard the ship that likes him for him. That may have been too much to squeeze into the end, but it was hard to see a happy ending when Georgia is a literal gold digger. Charlie Chaplin is a legend in cinema. If you haven't seen his movies, you absolutely should. The Gold Rush and Modern Times are amazing ones to start on. In addition to those, Robert Downey Jr. absolutely crushes playing Charlie Chaplin in a biopic, Chaplin, from 1992. Tom Murray brings some dark and dramatic tones to the story as Black Larson. He's never really lightened up for the sake of the movie being a comedy. He actually contrasts the primary tone of the movie, but never in a way that feels out of balance. Mark Swain is the standout co-star for me. He's in the majority of the most iconic comedic bits, keeping pace with Charlie Chaplin the whole time. He does a great job in a silent movie by having such an incredibly expressive face. His physicality next to Chaplin also provides an interesting contrast, but one that's more to the tone of the movie than the dark tones that Murray's performance brought. Georgia Hale was also in City Lights with Chaplin, another classic. Of course, I'd say watch that one third. I get what they were going for with her character and the emotional grounding that she provided, but the way she treated him and then only got interested when he had money did not age very well for me. Hale did a fine job in the role. It was the character that rubbed me the wrong way, not the performer. When The Gold Rush hit theaters in 1925, it was praised as a masterpiece. Critics loved Chaplin's ability to blend comedy and drama that made audiences laugh and also tugged at their heartstrings. Chaplin's physical comedy and clever storytelling techniques were also loved along with the groundbreaking visuals provided, namely in the teetering cabin bit we just discussed. Even 100 years on, this movie is held on a high pedestal as one of the most celebrated silent films of all time. Many of the gags in the movie, even the ones I didn't spell out in this recap, are iconic and still reused, recycled, and redone to this day. It's considered one of Chaplin's greatest, if not the greatest, but that all depends on who you ask. I love this movie, but if I had to choose, Modern Times would still be my number one. In 1992, the same time that Robert Downey Jr.'s biopic was released, The Gold Rush was chosen to be preserved in the National Film Registry. Chaplin famously resisted the talkies for a while, but in 1942 he re-released The Gold Rush with a whole new score and narration that replaced the title cards. The re-release was received well enough, but many preferred the original as a stamp in time and for what it was. For this review, I watched a nice restoration of the original on Amazon Prime. I watched a couple clips of the re-release on YouTube just to get a feel for it, and in my opinion, the redo was completely unnecessary. The original version had a staggering budget of $923,000. Using a basic online inflation calculator, which I know doesn't tell the full story of anything, equates to around 17 million US today. This made it one of the most expensive films of its time. It went on to gross over $4 million worldwide, and that's in 1925 $5, I didn't adjust it for inflation, which made it a monster hit for the era. I don't have figures on what the re-release cost to do or what it brought in, but it is said to have been very profitable for Chaplin and the studios. Check out this playlist for all of the AFI Top 100 movies covered so far, and be sure to subscribe to follow the list all the way down to number 1.